There comes a time in life when one gets tired of holding on to the untenable, not because of weakness, but because of lucidity, not because of a lack of strength, but because of an excess of awareness. It becomes impossible to continue defending what harms us, what no longer resonates with who we are learning to be. And so one falls silent, not out of resignation, but because the external noise no longer competes with the internal voice that is beginning to awaken. That is where the process begins. One begins to silently leave the places where one no longer fits. One begins to quietly withdraw from the relationships that drain, the habits that destroy, the thoughts that sabotage. No one notices it at first, but something inside changes forever. We do not need to make a public announcement every time we decide to choose ourselves. Nor do we have to answer to the world for everything we let go. Sometimes, true personal revolution is not shouted about. It is practiced in the everyday, in the invisible, in the small but powerful details. The moment one stops tolerating guilt as a guide, complacency as a strategy, or fear as a compass, a quiet but unstoppable revolution begins in that silent act of looking inward and saying, "No more." One of the biggest mistakes we make is believing that we must remain who we were in order to keep our relationships intact. We dress up in characters that do not represent us, we smile reflexively, we say what is expected, we hold conversations that no longer have soul. All of this in the name of peace, but it is a false peace. Because true peace does not consist of avoiding conflict, but in ceasing to live at war with oneself. And what is the point of a life in which one must hide in order to be accepted? Choosing ourselves does not always feel heroic, sometimes it feels uncomfortable, lonely, even contradictory, but it is in that discomfort that authenticity occurs. When we stop acting, who we are reappears, without embellishments, without emotional makeup. And there we can finally breathe, not from the image we project, but from internal coherence. Coherence is not perfection, it is alignment. It is when what we think, feel, and do starts to move in the same direction. And if I told you that the cost of pleasing everyone is often losing yourself, that in that eagerness not to lose anyone you are losing yourself, perhaps you already know it, perhaps you have already felt it. That lump in your throat when you do not say what you really think, that emotional fatigue that does not go away with rest, that feeling of being full of people but empty of yourself. All of these are signs, not that you are failing, but that something inside you is asking for change. Today you could start. You do not need to do everything at once, you do not need to explain to anyone. You just need to observe honestly and take the first step. Sometimes the most profound change happens without witnesses, without words, without promises. It only happens because you can no longer live another day in a borrowed version of yourself. Procrastination is also a form of renunciation, a subtle renunciation, disguised as prudence, preparation, strategic waiting, but deep down it is often just a matter of resignation. Fear. Fear of making a mistake, fear of being judged, fear of recognizing that it's time and that continuing to postpone has consequences. There is no decision more costly than the one not made, because life doesn't stop while you think and move. Time goes on, and with it the possibility of inhabiting a fuller existence slips through the cracks of the hereafter. We live as if we had a spare life, as if there were always another opportunity, another version of events, another ideal moment. But the truth, and it's not a comfortable truth, is that many times that ideal moment doesn't arrive, and what was going to be a pending conversation becomes a perpetual wound. What was going to be a postponed project turns into a regret. What was going to be a courageous yes ends up being a what if that stays with us until the end. Inaction also leaves a mark, and sometimes it's deeper than the mistake. What is postponed doesn't disappear, it accumulates. It becomes a silent list of pending issues that we carry on our backs, and each time we add a new one, something inside us shrinks. Because we know, even if we don't say it, that we are betraying a part of our truth. Procrastination is not just a problem with scheduling. It is an emotional disconnect with what we consider important. What kind of life are we building, if the most meaningful things are always left for later? When we understand this, we begin to look at the present with different eyes, not as an empty space that needs to be filled, but as the only fertile ground we truly have to sow something different. Tomorrow is not guaranteed, and that should not generate anguish, but clarity. Here you are telling later what part of yourself you are leaving for later, as if it were secondary. Because the life you want to build does not begin the day everything is in order, perfect, or without obstacles. It begins the day you take charge of your voice, your decisions, your silences. Many wait for a sign, something external that will push them to act. But the sign is the discomfort itself, the sigh that escapes when you realize that you are still in the same place. It is the annoyance you feel when you see others moving forward and you are still hesitating. It is the discomfort of living far from what you want, disguised as prudence. You don't need more signs, you need courage, not to do everything today, but to stop postponing it indefinitely. And if you still have doubts, ask yourself how much longer you are going to wait to live the life you know you want. Not so that others will applaud it, not so that everything will fall into place, just so that at the end of the day you can look at yourself honestly and feel that you are inhabiting your existence, not surviving it by waiting. The past has a subtle way of invading the present. It doesn't make a sound, it doesn't knock on the door, but it settles in repetitive thoughts, in unexplained emotions, in reactions that don't match what is happening now. Sometimes we think we have overcome it just because we stop talking about it, but silence doesn't always mean healing. It is often just a way of surviving, and what is not reviewed repeats itself. What is not faced becomes a shadow. Many carry guilt that is not theirs, wounds that have not healed, mistakes that punish themselves over and over again. The mind as if suffering were a form of redemption. But it is not. Suffering does not correct the past, it only extends its effect, it only prolongs its presence. We must understand something essential. The past cannot touch you if you do not feed it. And we feed it every time we get caught up in what could have been, in what was done to us, in what we failed to avoid. Each memory that comes back with pain is a call to look at it from another place, not to deny it or justify it, but to say, this happened, but it no longer defines me. It's not about forgetting or forgiving quickly, or turning pain into a forced lesson. Sometimes there is no immediate lesson, there is only experience. And accepting that is already an act of maturity, because the past hurts less when we stop demanding meaning from it. Not everything has an explanation, not everything is resolved with a why. There are things that simply happened, people who failed, versions of yourself that will never return, and continuing to stir up what was only prevents you from living what is. It is normal to want to understand, but when understanding becomes a way of avoiding letting go, we are trapped. And that trap is dangerous. Because while you are tied to the past, you cannot build a solid present. You are there, but you are not completely there. You react from old wounds. You make decisions from a place of defense, you relate from a place of suspicion, and so, without realizing it, you become a repeat of a story that is already over, but that you continue to tell as if it were still happening. Healing is not erasing, it is integrating, it is remembering without it hurting the same. It is being able to say, yes, this left its mark on me, but it also no longer guides me. And that process is slow, but deeply liberating. Because when you manage to stop looking back with anger or sadness, something new begins to appear. The possibility of looking forward with hope, not naivety, not fantasy, real hope, the kind that is born when you know that what happened to you does not determine what you are going to do. Ask yourself honestly, how many times a day do you live in the present and how many times are you held back by what no longer exists? Maybe you are tired, not because of what you are experiencing now, but because of everything you continue to carry without realizing it, and perhaps the time has come to put down that backpack. You do not need to solve everything today. But you can begin to recognize that remaining tied to what was does not make you faithful, strong, or fair to yourself. It only keeps you away from yourself. There are bonds that are not companions, they are anesthesia, relationships that are not born of love, but of emptiness. And when one confuses love with need, one ends up giving up parts of oneself in exchange for something that is not even real. You call it love, but it is fear. You call it commitment, but it is dependency. And the worst thing is that from the outside everything seems normal. They laugh together, share spaces, post photos, but inside someone is missing out. They are keeping too quiet, they are begging for attention, they are accepting emotional crumbs in order not to be left alone. A healthy relationship should not cost you your dignity. It should not require you to shrink so that the other person feels more comfortable. It should not make you invisible. True affection does not nullify, absorb, or condition. It does not turn your needs into whims or your limits into threats. But when one is emotionally dependent on someone, all of that is normalized, accepted as if it were the price of love. And love, when it is true, does not demand that price. We must have the courage to look inward and recognize when we are using the other person as a patch for our own cracks. It is not easy to accept this because it implies admitting that our stability is sustained by an external presence, that if the other person leaves we do not know who we are. That if the other person gets angry we fall apart, that if the other person distances us we feel like everything is collapsing. That is not a relationship. It is a form of emotional survival and living from there breaks us sooner or later. No one is going to come to complete you. That romantic idea of the better half has done more harm than good, because it puts you in a constant search for something that only you can give yourself. It is not about not loving or closing yourself off from relationships. It is about arriving complete, not incomplete, about sharing from fullness, not from lack, about being able to say, I love you, without it meaning that without you, I am worthless. When one begins to take care of oneself, one also begins to choose differently. One no longer looks for someone to save oneself, but someone to accompany oneself. One no longer needs constant validation from the other. One no longer tolerates emotional blackmail or power relationships disguised as affection, because one has understood something essential. Love should not hurt like this. It should not be a constant roller coaster of anxiety, doubts, and fear of abandonment. Love should be a refuge, not a storm. And if hearing this makes something inside you uncomfortable, you feel that there are parts of your life that are sustained by the need to don't be alone, don't ignore it. It's not about judging yourself, it's about waking up, about starting to build a relationship with yourself so solid that no absence can destabilize you. Because when you learn to be okay with yourself, no relationship becomes a prison and then you can love freely, not from dependency, but from choice. Worrying about what hasn't happened yet is a way of living in a world that only exists in the imagination. A world full of catastrophic scenarios, anticipated rejections, failures that haven't happened yet. And the most painful thing is that the body doesn't distinguish between a real threat and an imagined threat. It reacts the same, tensing up, speeding up, exhausting itself. We end up exhausted, not because of what we're experiencing, but because of what we think we're going to experience. And so, day after day, anxiety settles in like a constant presence, like a backdrop that contaminates even the good moments. Sometimes we convince ourselves that anticipating the bad protects us, as if imagining everything that could go wrong makes us stronger or more prepared. But in reality, that mechanism only makes us stronger or more prepared. But in reality, that mechanism only makes us feel better. It distances us from the present, disconnects us, prevents us from enjoying, acting, deciding, because everything is tinged with suspicion, by the expectation that something is going to go wrong. We live with the handbrake on, with our minds elsewhere, as if the now were not enough, as if we had to be ready for a threat that has not yet presented itself. Controlling everything is a fantasy. And the desire to control is born of fear, but controlling is not the same as caring. Controlling is suffocating. It is trying to anticipate every step, every reaction, every outcome with the illusion of avoiding pain. And the paradox is that by doing that, we are already suffering in advance, we are already losing, because we are giving away the only real moment we have, this one, the present. And if you lose the present, you also lose your life. It is not about becoming carefree or irresponsible. It is about distinguishing between what I can do now and what is simply beyond my control. It is about learning to trust a little more in the ability to adapt, in the strength that one has developed after everything we have experienced. You've overcome so much. You've faced days you thought you wouldn't make it through. Why do you still doubt yourself so much? Anxiety is often not a problem for the future, but a disconnect from the present. And returning to the present doesn't require complex techniques. Sometimes all it takes is to stop, breathe, observe, name what you're feeling, and ask yourself honestly, is what I'm worried about happening now, or am I just anticipating it? Is there anything I can do right now, or am I just ruminating on the worst? Maybe it's time to stop fighting with the future and start living in the present, not because the present is perfect, but because it's the only thing you can touch, change, breathe. Everything else is a mirage. And living in mirages, no matter how elaborate, will never be enough for a mind that seeks peace and a heart that needs to rest. Holding on to a grudge is like taking poison while waiting for the other person to get sick. It's a silent act of self-destruction. You think you're defending your dignity, that holding on to that anger is a way of not forgetting what happened, of not allowing it to happen again, but in reality every time you feed that resentment, you are reliving the damage. You are not overcoming it, you are perpetuating it, and the worst thing is that many times the other person is not even there. They are gone, they do not know, they do not understand, or they do not care, and you are still there tied to an emotion that consumes you, that makes you less free. Forgiving is not justifying, it is not forgetting, it is not reconciling. Sometimes forgiveness is not even said out loud, it happens inside. It is a silent decision to stop dragging on what is no longer fixable. It is not about being good or showing moral superiority. It is about stopping hurting yourself with a story that can no longer be changed, because the past cannot be erased, but the bond you have with that past can be transformed, and that only depends on you. You are not obligated to forgive. There are no time frames or formulas. Each process is unique, but what you should ask yourself is whether that resentment is still useful, if it protects you or locks you up, if it gives you strength or it takes away your peace. Sometimes we think that resentment keeps us alert, that it makes us stronger, but the truth is that it makes us rigid, it hardens our hearts. And a hardened heart does not love freely, it loves with distrust, with conditions, with fear. There comes a time when one has to decide whether one wants to continue being a victim or if one is ready to regain emotional control of one's life. It is not about denying what happened or minimizing it, on the contrary, it is about acknowledging the pain with total clarity, without embellishments, without excuses. But after that acknowledgement comes the decision: do you want to live with that wound forever, or do you want to start building something different from there? Forgiving is not a favor to the other person, it is an act of compassion for oneself. It is a way of saying, this happened to me, it hurt me, it left its mark on me, but it will not define me anymore. And that can't be achieved in a day. But it starts with a decision. Stop feeding the fire, stop mentally replaying the scene, stop talking about the subject with every person who will listen, because when you repeat it over and over again, you're not processing it, you're reliving it, and that exhausts you in the long run. Maybe today you can ask yourself, what resentment still binds you? What name, what face, what memory still takes up emotional space in you, even though you say you've overcome it? And more importantly, who would you be if you stopped carrying that around? We were taught to see happiness as a goal, as a finish line after much effort, sacrifice, and waiting. A kind of prize reserved only for those who manage to meet all the requirements for success. A stable partner, a secure bank account, a respectable job, an accepted image. But that promise is rarely fulfilled, because when we reach one goal, another appears, and then another, and the satisfaction is short-lived, it dissolves, is replaced by a new demand. And so, without realizing it, we enter a race without end. We run, we accumulate, we show off, we compare, but we still feel like something is missing. Happiness is not a finishing point, it is not a future goal, it is a way of being present, an internal coherence between what you value, what you do, and what you allow. And when that aligns, even simple days feel full. Even routines make sense, not because everything is resolved, but because one has stopped waiting for something external to come and complete it. That waiting that we so often mistake for hope is actually a trap. A trap that keeps us always dissatisfied, always waiting, always postponing real life. How many times have you said, when I have this, I will be happy? How many times have you conditioned your well-being to an event that has not yet arrived? The problem is not having goals, the problem is believing that your value, your peace and your joy depend on them, because then you do not live, you condition yourself and any obstacle in the way becomes a threat to your stability. You become fragile, anxious, addicted to the next conquest, and in that state it is almost impossible to stop and be grateful for what already is, for what you already are. Society has romanticized the idea of future happiness, has turned it into a product, into a promise that it sells, but the truth is simpler and at the same time more challenging. Real happiness is not found, it is built, and it is built in everyday actions, in how you talk to yourself, in what you choose to allow, in the small decisions that you repeat every day. There is no magic moment that changes everything. There are continuous choices that bring you closer or further away from yourself. And when you understand this, you stop chasing and begin to inhabit. You no longer need life to give you everything you dreamed of to feel peace. You begin to find meaning. Even in imperfection, even on gray days, because your emotional state no longer depends on the external world, but on a deeper connection with yourself. A connection that is not built with awards or recognition, but with presence, honesty, and authenticity. Perhaps the question is not, what do I need to be happy? But rather, what am I ignoring today that would do me good? Because happiness does not always come with noise, sometimes it comes in silence, in the form of tranquility, coherent decisions, honest relationships. And if we do not learn to see it there, in the simple things, we run the risk of spending our lives searching for it without realizing that we had already achieved it long ago. Explaining ourselves all the time is tiring, not only because it demands energy, but because it exposes a wound, the need for constant approval. We live justifying what we feel, what we decide, what we choose to leave behind, as if we needed permission to live our own life, as if every move had to be validated by someone else. And when that becomes a habit, we lose clarity, because we no longer know if we are doing things for the right reason. conviction, or fear of disappointing. You are not obligated to explain every step you take. You do not have to give reasons every time you decide to prioritize yourself. You do not need to turn your evolution into a speech that others understand. Sometimes you do not even fully understand what you are doing, but you know that it is necessary. And that is enough, because there are decisions that do not arise from logic, but from emotional awareness. And that awareness does not always have words, it only has internal certainties. Silent ones that push you forward. The need to justify yourself usually comes from childhood, from having grown up under gazes that demanded performance, obedience, perfection. But you are no longer that child. You are no longer obligated to convince anyone of your value. Every time you feel the urge to explain your change, your distance, your no, your silence, stop. Ask yourself, do I really have to explain myself, or am I seeking forgiveness for choosing what is good for me? When someone is at peace with their decisions, external noise no longer has as much power, not because it becomes indifferent, but because it ceases to be decisive. There are people who will not understand your limits, who will be offended when you stop pleasing them, who will project guilt when you choose something different. That is part of the process. You can't control how it will be received. You can only make sure that your choice is aligned with who you are, with what you need. And that is not selfishness, it is emotional maturity. It is knowing that living from authenticity is not always going to be comfortable, but it is necessary, because if you continue to shape your actions so that others are not uncomfortable, you are erasing yourself a little more each day, and there comes a point where, if you do not do something, you no longer know who you are, you only know what others expect of you. Being true to yourself sometimes means disappointing others, but that disappointment is not your responsibility. Everyone has the right to react as they may, and you have the right to move forward, not from conflict, but from clarity, not from resentment, but from respect. Sometimes, the greatest expression of self-love is not saying anything, just acting, just living, just being, without justifying yourself, without translating yourself, without asking permission. Perhaps the time has come to stop explaining yourself, not out of arrogance, but for peace, not because you don't care about the other person, but because your integrity is very important to you. And when that happens, every decision you make, even if it is not understood, becomes an act of silent coherence. Taking care of yourself is not an aesthetic act, it is an ethical act. It is a silent commitment to your mental clarity, to your emotional strength, to your ability to sustain life without collapsing inside. And yet, many times we relegate that care to the end of the list. We sleep poorly, we eat without awareness. We surround ourselves with constant stimuli, we get distracted compulsively, we call it routine, we justify it with obligations, but in reality it is abandonment, a slow, progressive abandonment, which gradually extinguishes the vital energy we need to think clearly, feel deeply, and decide maturely. The body and the mind are not separate, they never have been. What you do with one affects the other. If you eat poorly, your thinking becomes slower and more erratic. If you don't rest, your patience shortens and your judgment becomes clouded. If you're constantly stimulated by noise, screens, messages, tasks, you lose the ability to be silent with yourself, and that silence is what you need to truly listen to yourself. But since we can't stand it, we fill it up, and so we continue to do more, feel less, accumulate tasks, and forget basic needs. Bad habits aren't immediately noticeable. They're silent, but they leave traces on your skin, your mood, your memory, and the way you talk to yourself. And when you finally notice the weight, you've been carrying it for years. Sometimes we seek great spiritual answers, external solutions, new life philosophies, but we continue to sleep for 4 hours, drink coffee instead of water, and check our phones as if we can't be alone with our thoughts. We want transformation without discipline. We want peace without internal order. But that's not how it works. You don't need to become a wellness fanatic. It's not about following strict routines or imposing rules that only generate more guilt. It's about responsibility, about recognizing that if you don't take care of your system, no one will do it for you. That emotional lucidity also depends on whether you're eating what you need, whether you're breathing calmly, whether you're taking real breaks, because the mind can't sustain itself on its own. It needs a body to support it, not one that sabotages it. And changing habits isn't easy. It requires repetition, it requires uncomfortable decisions, it requires reviewing what you're choosing every day without realizing it, but valuable things don't come easy. And you know because you've experienced it, that when you improve your basic routines, everything feels different, not magically, but really. You have more presence, more patience, more clarity, not by chance, but because you're functioning in a way that's more coherent with your biology, with your humanity. Perhaps today you could ask yourself just one question: how am I treating the body that sustains everything I am? Not through punishment, not through demands, but through awareness, because every gesture of self-care is a silent statement. I want to be well, I want to think clearly, I want to hold this life with more strength. And that is not achieved with words, it is achieved with actions, with choices, with perseverance, even and especially when no one is watching. No.